Hey guys, today we're going to discuss Plato's dialogue, The Apology, which is one of Plato's earliest dialogues, and as such, it's understood to be a more or less faithful rendering of his teacher Socrates' views, and in this case, a good representation, an accurate depiction of what went on in the courtroom in Athens in 399 BC, where Socrates was facing an indictment brought against him by the figures Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Um, Now, this is a dialogue, and I mentioned as a part of Plato's early works, and as such, it fits into a narrative thread. So preceding this dialogue is one called the Euthyphro, which is named after Socrates' main interlocutor within that story, Euthyphro. And he encounters Euthyphro on his way to the court where he is first to learn of these charges being brought in the indictment against him. But Euthyphro himself, and I'll mention this dialogue again because it's relevant a little bit later today, is there not to face charges but to bring them. And then later on, Socrates finds himself in the court defending himself. And after that, so we don't, of course, spoiler alert, Socrates is convicted of his charges. He's found guilty and ultimately sentenced to death. But we don't see him die at the end of this dialogue. That's reserved for later. So following the apology, there's the Crito, which is where you see Socrates engaged in conversation with many friends and followers who are at that point trying to convince him that the most just outcome would be for him to flee, to enjoy this kind of self-imposed exile, which is ultimately what those who are bringing the indictment against him wanted. And he rebuffs them. And then following that, the dialogue Phaedo, which is where we again encounter Socrates engaged in deep, expansive philosophical conversation with his friends, but this time in an effort to assuage their very real and characteristically mortal fears about death and finitude. And at the conclusion of that dialogue, Socrates is compelled by the jailer to drink the poison, the hemlock, and he perishes. So there's a lot going on in this dialogue, the apology. In fact, I could dedicate an entire class, an entire quarter, to just mining its philosophical depths. So I'm going to limit my points of observation and commentary to a few important themes or features. And so I prepared a few slides to do that. But just to say a few things about Plato and Socrates and their relationship. So I mentioned earlier today that the Apology is one of Plato's so-called early dialogues. His literary output is typically divided by experts and commentators into three periods, the so-called early, middle, and late. In the early, like in the Apology, we get a more or less faithful rendering or representation of Socrates' own philosophical views, commitments, typical questions he would pose, and so forth. And in the case of a kind of courtroom drama that we see encapsulated in the Apology, a fairly accurate telling or narration of what went down. And we can see that Plato is a name that comes up at one point in the course of the dialogue where Socrates mentions that he is there in the audience. So it's typically understood that Plato would have a good working knowledge of Socrates' own efforts in the courtroom to defend himself. Although we, of course, have to be suspicious of Socrates' motivations in carrying out that performance, given that he acts kind of like an asshole, I would say. He's deliberately inflammatory and provocative at several points throughout, and he is most assuredly unapologetic in the typical English language understanding of that term. So I'm going to share the screen and work through a slideshow that I've prepared. Okay, so here we have Socrates and Plato. On the right, a famous sculpture of Plato, and on the left, this is the depiction of the character Socrates in, of course, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, or as they call it in there, Socrates. So here are the respective dates corresponding to the lives of Socrates and Plato. And below here, I have a number of the important topics or themes that I want to emphasize and work through today. So the first is rhetoric versus dialectic, and that's really at the heart of what's going on here. And as you'll see, I'll spend quite a bit of time at the beginning or the setup of this dialogue. Human versus superhuman wisdom, all of these are interrelated, by the way, these themes. The philosopher is a kind of gadfly, which is how Socrates presents himself at one point in the dialogue. A gadfly, that is a kind of horsefly or an irritating insect, a biting insect. The relationship between philosophy and the examined life, and we'll talk about that. What is the true nature of expertise if human wisdom is always finite or imperfect or perspectival, and in that sense limited wisdom? What does it mean to be truly an expert if that doesn't entail infallible possession of the truth? And then, of course, there's the relationship between philosophy and death, which I'm not sure I'm going to say much about today. If there are questions about that, feel free to reach out. So, well, what's going on in this dialogue? Well, there are some really interesting things in just its literary framing to call attention to. So, and I say interesting in the philosophical sense, insofar as these points of reference I'm going to make are helpful in illuminating something essential about the nature of philosophy, more generally and more specifically about how these concepts and these particular functions or human technical competencies play into it, such as how we can describe rhetoric or, in contrast, dialectic. Well, how does it begin? In the very beginning of the dialogue, men of Athens, how you have felt at hearing the speeches of my accusers, I cannot tell. But I know that their persuasive words almost made me forget who I was. So a couple things are going on there. First of all, we as readers or listeners are thrown right into the thick of this narrative, of this story unfolding before us. That is to say, if we had been there the whole time, we would have heard Meletus's articulation of the charges that he and the two others, Anytus and Lycon, are bringing against Socrates, who by this time in his life is around the age of 70. So he's quite old, and he's developed quite a profound and far-reaching reputation for himself, primarily surrounding his purported philosophical wisdom, but also because it's the case, and we have this information through more than one source, historical source. Socrates was a bit of a war hero, right? So he was a competent hoplite, or a Greek warrior, who fought valiantly in several battles well into his middle-aged period and showed valor in a number of contexts. So we're thrown right into the middle here, which gives suggestion to this important philosophical nugget or truth that we're going to pull out of here. And that is that there is, strictly speaking, no ultimate beginning. That is to say, there is no blank slate. There is no primary condition of perfect ignorance that you emerge from the background or basis of in your pursuit of knowledge, self-knowledge, and so forth. There is always already some prior condition to which we are thrust into the milieu where we find ourselves and thus compelled to respond. And so that's an important point. But so Socrates, and we see him addressing the court at the very beginning. Who exactly is he addressing? Well, in the Athenian legal structure, we're dealing here with a jury of 300 of Socrates' peers. So imagine that, this huge room, this official context or space, which is riven with and defined and refined in its sort of character and purpose by norms, right? So there are right ways and wrong ways to behave in a courtroom, as of course we know today, right? You wouldn't walk into a courtroom wearing flip-flops and refer to the judge as bro or whatever, right? So there are certain norms that delimit what can go on, what must go on, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what those who are already present in the courtroom would be set up in advance to anticipate and to receive and so forth, right? So that's going on. And further, I should point out that within the Athenian legal system, there were no discrete roles set aside for attorneys, lawyers, and so forth. So in this case, we have a case being brought against Socrates by Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon, which means that they, in particular Meletus, who laid out the terms of the indictment before we find Socrates speaking, would have to make the case. That is, they would have to convince or persuade the jury of the truth of their position. Whether or not Meletus, Anytus, Lycon, and others who are advancing their particular view or position are doing so in a good faith manner. That is, whether or not they themselves embrace their own sort of case as the side of the case that they are defending as the truth. So we'll talk about philosophy in the examined life, the true nature of expertise, as I mentioned, and philosophy of death. So let's move on. So before spending much time in this particular dialogue, the apology, I want to go through some preliminary moves in another dialogue, which, although narratively obviously precedes what's going on in the apology, given that Socrates doesn't live much longer and he remains in the state custody following the trial. So this is an event that occurred many years before Socrates' trial, but as a literary work, as a product of Plato's writing, it represents his middle period. So in the middle period of Plato's writing, he still uses the dialogical form in which Socrates is the typical chief protagonist, that is, the main defender of Plato's own views. Now he becomes a kind of mouthpiece where Plato is articulating his own philosophical insights. And then in the later period of Plato, we see him critically turn back on the substance and doctrines, if you would like to call it such, from the middle period in a way that anticipates much of the criticism that Aristotle himself would leverage against Platonic dualism. And we'll talk more about Platonic metaphysics and dualism around week 7 after the midterm, when we return to Plato and his dialogue, The Republic. So right now we're trying to track down the truth of rhetoric. And so by working a little bit through the Gorgias, what we're going to do is we're going to figure out how to distinguish or discriminate rhetoric as a mode of discourse, as a kind of art or technical that is practical science, from philosophical practice as such, which is more characterized by dialectic. And we're going to achieve this by way of dialectic itself. So we're going to attain a kind of performative disclosure of the very essence of dialectic as we move ahead towards this kind of discursive elaboration of the essence of rhetoric in itself. Okay, so in this dialogue, the Gorgias, Gorgias is a real historical figure. He's a well-known progenitor of sophistry. And the word sophistry or sophism has a kind of negative or pejorative connotation to it now. But who were the sophists? The sophists like Gorgias, there are other well-known ones such as Protagoras, who's also the namesake of another of Plato's middle dialogues. But the sophists were these itinerant teachers who traveled around wherever they might have been wanted and taught the art or science of rhetoric, typically to the children, the offspring of famous aristocrats, and they were paid handsomely for their knowledge. And so Athens was a very litigious society, as we can see exemplified in what's going on with poor Socrates in our dialogue. And so you could achieve great political and social clout and power if you developed the competency in rhetorical performance. That is to say, if you could master the discursive skills necessary that would be most appropriate for particular contexts where power could be won and lost, context, for example, like this courtroom, then you could establish great reputation, a lasting name not only for yourself, but also for your family, and amass great wealth and consolidate and expand your influence and so forth. And so here in this dialogue, the Gorgias, we find Socrates visiting the house of Callicles. And Callicles is someone who very much values sophistry and the power that learning the competency of rhetoric, that is the skills of the sophist, endows one with. And he's entertaining, he's hosting Gorgias at his house in Athens. So Socrates is with his friend Chaerephon, who is mentioned once in the Apology as the friend of Socrates, who asked the famous Delphic oracle whether or not there was anyone wiser than he, and the response, of course, was no, and we'll return to that issue in a moment. So Chaerephon is there, and Socrates learns that Gorgias is in town, and of course, Gorgias has this great reputation. He's well known, he's quite famous, and so Socrates wants to question him as he questions the other so-called pretenders to wisdom. And in this case, he wants to question Gorgias about the nature of rhetoric itself, or rhetoricae techne, the art of rhetoric, which is the title of one of Aristotle's later books, who lays out in a codified fashion the essential building blocks for a legitimate rhetorical art, in a way that decouples it necessarily from ethical or moral considerations. Right? But that's rather dangerous. And Aristotle does so later on the basis of what Plato makes possible in dialogues like the Gorgias, and I submit also in part the Apology. And so we can talk more about that in a moment. So Socrates wants to know, he asks, the first question is, who are you, Gorgias? What are you? Is perhaps a different way to put it. Well, he's an orator, he's a rhetorician, and he comes finally around to saying that. That's what I do. So Socrates is like, all right, if I asked you that and you said I was a cobbler, if you said you were a cobbler or a shoemaker, in other words, and now I asked you, okay, as a cobbler or a shoemaker, what is your domain? What exactly do you do? Well, the answer is clear. You're a maker of shoes, just like a musician. If you were to ask, okay, what is the province of your business? What is it that you do? Well, I make melody or harmony or rhythm or whatever else you might say. So insofar as Gorgias is a master of rhetoric, in other words, an orator or a rhetorician, Socrates wants him to delimit that province or domain of expertise in a similar fashion. So what is rhetoric, and what is it that rhetoricians like Gorgias practice? So the first answer, and this was actually given by a student, a kind of disciple or acolyte of Gorgias, Polus, who is quickly dismissed because he's obviously not very serious. But he says, oh, well, rhetoric is the greatest thing. That's what it is. It's the best thing there is. Next question. To which Socrates responds, well, I think Polus might be better skilled in the art of rhetoric than he is in the art of dialectic. And they ask, well, why? Why do you say that? And he says, well, because I asked what rhetoric is, not some quality in a secondary sense that it might have. And when you responded that rhetoric is the greatest thing, you were answering as if someone was besmirching it, right? I'm simply asking what it is. I'm not asking you to give me any sort of praise or justification for it. What is rhetoric? That'd be like if you're obsessed with shoes or something. And I asked you, well, what is a shoemaker? Like, what is a cobbler? I don't know what that means. I'm not familiar with the term. And you say, oh, they're the best. Okay, that might be helpful if I had other details in possession behind me here to work with, but I don't know what that means. It's not answering the question. So Gorgias comes in and he says, rhetoric is the source of freedom for mankind itself. And at the same time, it is for each person the source of rule over others in one's city. It is the ability to persuade judges in a law court, counselors in a council meeting, an assemblyman in an assembly, or in any other gathering that might take place. But before this, actually, Gorgias answered more simply that it is discourse. And the word for discourse, and we'll get to this in a moment, as you see in the bottom of the screen, is logos, right? So it's logos. Well, logos is a word in Greek with a huge range of sense, a broad constellation of meaning. It can mean sentence, story, similar to mythos, from which we get myth, account, argument, and so forth. It can also mean something like a rational principle, which is how it gets articulated in an earlier pre-Socratic philosopher, Heraclitus, where it becomes something of a piece of, a term of art in philosophy, a kind of piece of technical philosophical vocabulary. But logos means language in this sense. Discourse is like speech or language, but obviously rhetoric isn't the only art or area of technical expertise that relies on or operates through speech or language. So for example, and this is one that Socrates mentions, the medical art or medical technique uses language or words, right? But unlike a medical practitioner, the words that we find in rhetoric, the kind of discourse we find there, is not necessarily tied to any sort of activity which that discourse is informing or making possible. Now it could be, but not necessarily, right? So it's without praxis. Praxis is the Greek word for action. So there might be some action that comes about because of rhetorical inspiration or motivation, but that would be something secondary to the discourse itself, right? Next, well, it's aimed at persuasion, right? And so we find that in this quotation here, right? So it is the ability to persuade judges in a law court, counselors in a council meeting, and assemblymen in an assembly or in any other gathering that might take place. So something important here about the nature of rhetoric is that it's tied to specific contexts, specific places, each of which, as I mentioned before, are shaped in part by norms which are pre-established, right? So rhetoric is appropriate only in particular contexts, one of which would happen to be the courtroom in which we find ourselves now. So it's aimed at persuasion. But here Socrates mentions, again, well, don't the other arts that rely on or operate through discourse, that is logos, don't they also try to persuade? So again, think back to your doctor situation. You go to a doctor, you're suffering from some physical malady, you're seeking advice or guidance. So the doctor lays out or prescribes for you some dietary restriction, some medicinal regimen, or something else, which on the basis of her expertise is thought or would be thought to help whatever is ailing you, whatever problem you're facing, right? Now, there's obviously some kind of persuasion here. So part of the doctor's discourse is going to be aimed at clarifying for you, helping you to understand, first of all, what might be the problem that you're facing and experiencing, and secondly, how the doctor's prescription is going to help. Now, the doctor isn't going to spend too much time persuading you. Let's say, and perhaps we all know someone like this, you're very suspicious of medical practitioners or of expertise more generally. And you don't think that the doctor necessarily has your best interests in mind. The doctor might spend a little bit trying to convince you that this is in fact the case, but at the end, look, you can take it or leave it, the doctor might say. This is what is wrong with you. This is what I think you should do. If you don't accept that, fine. Go seek another opinion. Go talk to a witch doctor or an astrologer or someone else. I don't really care, right? So there's that kind of persuasion. But that's not what's going on in rhetoric, right? Because the doctor's office is not one of these places or contexts where the power of persuasion is appropriate. That is, where it is already existing and helping to delimit the space and its meaning through these norms that I mentioned before. And that's because the doctor's office is in a place where you're dealing with a multitude of individuals who in various ways are more or less heterogeneous. That is, they come from different backgrounds, they have different concerns, there are different problems that they're focused on, and so forth. And also in these contexts, another feature that makes them similar or brings them together would be that they're usually dealing in these situations with something that requires a judgment or a decision through a process of deliberation with a limited amount of time, right? So some conclusion has to be reached, and there isn't a lot of time to do it, and there are a lot of people who have to be convinced or persuaded or pushed in one direction or another to achieve that. So says, well, Socrates, I think, since we're not talking about anyone who uses logos, that is speech, to convince, we're talking about a more constrained, that is a more narrow field in which rhetoric as such, as a particular mode of discourse operates. It would be, he says, in the kinds of mass meetings which happen in law courts and so on, and I think its province is the domain of right and wrong. That is to say, where right or wrong judgments and decisions and conclusions can be made or reached. Okay. So, and then Socrates asks this question. Now, do you think that the state of having been taught something is the same as the state of having been convinced? And so the word for persuasion or conviction, or for the state of having been convinced, are synonymous with another word that might come up in these contexts, belief. So all of these words, persuasion, conviction, belief, are translated from the Greek word pistis. And so that's the root from which we get one of our fundamental, that is traditional divisions or branches of philosophy, epistemology, which is focused on the fundamental nature of knowledge. Okay. And so episteme is a word that's related to pistis, but it's something more. Episteme means something close, and this is through the kind of systematic codification of these pieces of technical vocabulary through Aristotle. Episteme means something closer to like scientific knowledge as we understand that today. So the question that Socrates poses Gorgias, or poses to Gorgias, how do you do you think that the state of having been taught something is the same as the state of having been convinced. In other words, is learning the same as conviction or different? In my opinion, Socrates, they are different, Gorgias responds. Yes, you're right. And here's the proof of it, Socrates says. If you were asked, Gorgias, can conviction be either true or false? You'd answer, yes, I'm sure. Yes, Gorgias admits. But can knowledge be either true or false? Certainly not. Obviously, then, Socrates concludes, conviction and knowledge are not the same. Right? So pistis and gnosis. So gnosis, I mentioned episteme as one word for knowledge. The Greeks had a number of words for knowledge. One earlier of which was techne that I talked about before. Rhetoric techne would be the art or practical science of oratory or of speaking aimed at convincing, that sort of discourse. So obviously, pistis and gnosis. So gnosis is another word for knowledge, and it has obvious resonance, so kind of superficial affinity with our typical English word know or knowledge. But gnosis in the Greek sense was quite abstract and vague, whereas other deployments of the concept of knowledge which were much more exact and delimited by their specific domain. Episteme is like scientific knowledge, knowledge of universals, whereas techne is more like a kind of sophisticated and technically carved out and advanced practical know-how, right? So a shoemaker or a cobbler has a particular techne. And so you could go study as an apprentice under a given shoemaker, and you could learn the art of shoe craftsmanship. And so the idea that the knowledge that surrounds the production of shoes can be learned, that is to say taught, that is to say communicated to others, means that there are certain universal principles that one can learn and preserve through written and spoken language and pass on to posterity, right? And so the same would go for another techne we were just talking about, the medical art or medical techne. So if you go to medical school, you're learning universal principles or universally applicable propositions, which can then be employed to make sense of and to shape up certain particulars that arise in your experience, rather than having to rely on your imperfect experience to develop your skills through trial and error, right? So through a series of failures. That's a part of it as you learn to apply these universal principles to particular situations. But in techne, you can always go back to some established body of knowledge that will help you. There's my dog talking to me right now. Harry, go lie down, buddy. I'll help you out in a second. Okay, so let's go along with Socrates and Gorgias and try to track this down. So we started with discourse or logos, and then we circumscribe it, we rein in it a bit more. That's discourse without praxis. Further, it's aimed at persuasion, but of course, there are all sorts of discursive practices and efforts that are also going to try to persuade. So it's the kind of persuasive efforts that are appropriate or adequate for certain venues, such as those facing a multitude that have to be convinced within a finite or limited amount of time. And furthermore, and this is the important upshot, we're dealing with pistis or persuasion that is independent of knowledge, and knowledge is always of the truth. Right? So this is what separates a belief, which is another way to translate pistis, from knowledge. So it's obvious that one can have either true or false beliefs, right? So you might believe, for instance, that the earth is flat. But of course, I and the scientific community would disagree with you. They would say that that belief is not in concert with the truth, right? It's at odds with the truth. But in any case, you can go on believing it, right? Just as small children, or perhaps even certain adults, continue to believe in Santa Claus. Or, for instance, you might have a clock in your house that's broken, and so you take a glance at it at one moment and you think it's 10:30 a.m., when in fact it's 1 p.m., right? So at that moment, before you realize it's broken, you have the false belief that it's 10:30 a.m., right? But if you say you have knowledge of something, and then you go on to say it's false knowledge, unlike in the case of false or true belief, you have contradicted yourself. To say that you're in possession of false knowledge simply means that you're not in possession of any knowledge at all. And that's because, unlike belief, which has its own object that it applies to and encapsulates, which can either be true or false, the content of true knowledge must be, in every instance, regardless of the subject matter, of the truth. So when I say I know X, whatever X happens to be, insofar as it is knowledge of X, that knowledge is true. That is to say, X must be true. And the moment we realize that it's not true, we realize that we never had knowledge, although we did have belief. And so how does this work? It works through the rhetorician, the person deploying the rhetorical strategy, to operate on the basis of a careful economy or dynamic of revealing and concealing, where certain things are brought to the surface, are communicated through language, whereas others are kept hidden, right? Because otherwise, if you reveal too much, if you reveal what might inspire instead a kind of animosity or antagonism, well, then you're going to alienate at least a percentage of that multitude which it's your task to convince or to persuade, right? Okay. Now, what is dialectic, since what we're doing is trying to come to terms with the nature of philosophical discourse, which from the Socratic Platonic perspective unfolds via a dialectical process, which is very much in line with a kind of dialogical process. So dialectic derives from these root words. So dia, meaning across or through, and then lectic, it comes from the same origin etymologically as logos, which is a noun, and legein, which is grounded in logos, but as a verb, which would mean to speak. So if logos is discourse, legein is to discourse, that is to engage in discourse or speech. So what is logos? It's a kind of gathering of sense or meaning. So a bringing together into a sort of coherent harmony, disparate patches of data or thematic pre-understanding, fragmentary pieces of knowledge, or excuse me, to be more accurate, fragmentary pieces of experience, which could be assembled as knowledge through the assembling, that is, gathering power of speech. And this is facilitated by language, which brings to light what was previously hidden, that is, the truth. So importantly, language, logos, is similar to this Greek word pharmakon, which is the word from which we get pharmacy, pharmaceuticals, pharmacology, and so forth, meaning at the same time, medicine or cure and poison. So the Greek word pharmakon means at once cure and poison. It's ambiguous in its power. Similar to logos, it's ambiguous in its power, so described a moment before. It can be employed by a rhetorician or a philosopher, for example, to uncover the truth or to bury it or to conceal it for one's own purposes or aims. So knowledge, in every instance, is knowledge of the truth. But what is the truth? What is truth? Now, for the Greeks, our word in English, truth, derives from the word aletheia. And, excuse me, the prefix in Greek, a, it functions in a similar way to prefixes in English language, such as un or non. That is to say, it's negative or privative. It denies or negates whatever it's attached to. So Lethe, which is the root of Letheia, refers to one of 6 mythical rivers, which if one were to drink from or bathe in, one would be cast into an unceasing state of complete darkness or oblivion, that is to say, forgetfulness. One would no longer know who or where one is or what is happening. So aletheia, then, understood in this sense, literally means unhiddenness or unconcealment. Now, this is interesting, and we can take a moment to discuss this. It's interesting because in English, the concept of truth, like that with a capital T, for example, is often understood to ultimately have a positive sort of sense. That is to say, there is truth out there, right? The truth is out there. It's bare and more or less explicit in itself. It is out there and available and neutral, but for whatever reason, it gets obscured, it gets buried, it gets covered over, it gets complicated. And the task of the thinker or the pursuer of knowledge is to pierce through that obfuscation or to peel back and eliminate all of those layers of falsity and unclarity and so forth that are standing between you and the truth with the capital T. But notice how the Greek conception of aletheia turns that on its head. So from this vantage, truth is less essential, is less metaphysically primary than what we might call the untruth. So the unhiddenness or the unconcealment relies for its part on a prior state of hiddenness or concealment for the possibility of its own eventuality, of its own coming to be or coming to presence. And so this means that for those who pursue truth, it only arises, it's only one, if it happens at all, through a kind of temporal event. Because once you illuminate the truth in one region of reality, you have obscured or set aside some other domain of being or presence, which is now, because something else has been uncovered, for its part, is buried or obscured or rendered opaque. And so we'll explore this theme, this question, this problem in more detail. So now I want to work through, and again, like I said at the beginning today, I'll be spending most of the time at the setup or the beginning narrative kind of framing of the dialogue. So this is something I think I've mentioned already earlier, the beginning of the dialogue. How you felt, O men of Athens, at hearing the speeches of my accusers, I cannot tell, but I know that the persuasive words almost made me forget who I was. So this shows you, in a powerful way, I think, at the very beginning of the dialogue, the power of discourse, the power of speech. And it is precisely a displacing power where it is leveraged rhetorically in an effort to conceal the truth rather than to illuminate it. So here we find Socrates, he says, kind of ironically, I would suggest, playing with the audience, made to forget who he was, or almost made to forget who he was. And that connects to the sense in which Socrates calls attention to the fact that he is a stranger to the ways of the place. Now, the word strange in Greek is translated, the word strange, as we're dealing with it here in the English language, is translated from the Greek word atopos. So topos is a word that we've preserved in various forms in English. Topology, topography are just a couple immediate examples. And topos means place. So atopos, again, we have the negative prefix attached to the root. It means out of place or placeless. So when Socrates says he is a stranger to the ways of the place, in the context of the courtroom, where again, rhetorical discourse is most appropriate, is normatively prescribed, that is to say, Socrates is out of place, right? He's a stranger. And that's because he's going to be using a kind of discourse which is not appropriate for the courtroom. And that is a hint as to why Socrates' effort, if we understand this to be his effort, to achieve exoneration, that is, a not guilty verdict, was doomed from the beginning, right? Because he's not going to be able to convince anyone, those 300 jurors, in this place, the power of which is determined by the mechanisms of rhetoric, not dialectic. Okay. And so now he says, I have to reply to the older charges and to my first accusers, and then I will go to the later ones. So, Harry, go down. Go down, buddy. Sorry. Maybe you want to see Harry. There he is. I don't know what he wants. So this is a funny moment in the dialogue. He says, I have to reply to the older charges and to my first accusers, and then I will go to the later ones. That's kind of like, so imagine you go to court one day to face perhaps a series of unpaid parking tickets, right? So they've amassed and you have to address the judge. And you say in your defense, okay, I'm going to talk about, these parking tickets. And yeah, I've been accused of racking up all this debt to the city. I owe all this money because of unpaid tickets. But I just want everyone to know first that I've also been accused of beating my wife. That would not be the best strategy for you to, get out of paying those parking tickets, right? To sort of proliferate or multiply the charges. But that's what he's doing. So again, this is a moment where we should start to question what he's up to, whether his real aim in the so-called apology is for an emancipation, that is, for a not guilty verdict. And he says, these are the accusers whom I dread, for they are the circulators of this rumor, and their hearers are too apt to fancy that speculators of this sort do not believe in the gods. And they are many, and their charges against me are of ancient date, and they made them in days when you were impressible, in childhood and perhaps in youth, and the cause when heard went by default, for there was none to answer. Right? So unlike dialectic, which is a careful interchange of position and response, all aimed towards bringing to the light of day what was previously hidden or obscured, that is to say, towards the releasement of the truth. In the case of rhetoric, there is simply a kind of communication of a view aimed at persuasion with no space from which to reply, right? No critical distance. And what are these first accusations? So these are the product of this kind of indeterminate, placeless, free-floating rumor that Socrates, at now the age of around 70, had been the center of for decades. So what are they? Well, Socrates is an evildoer and a curious person who searches into things under the earth and in heaven, and he makes the worse appear the better cause, and that he teaches the aforesaid doctrines to others. And what are these charges exactly? Well, to say that he explores, what's going on below the earth and the heavens, well, that's natural philosophy, right? So that would be like the so-called pre-Socratics, who made such claims as everything is made of water, like Thales, or everything is made of air, like Anaximenes, right? To know about what's going on in the very recesses of the obscure earth, which is unavailable for human experience, or what's going on in the farthest distances of the universe, the cosmos, or the galaxy, right? These are necessarily beyond the possible scope of human experience. So that's one thing that Socrates has been charged with. And you might think, well, why is that a problem? Well, it could be a problem because of atheism, right? That if Socrates is pursuing these fundamental truths about the natural universe, then that means he's not content with theological, that is to say, traditional religious responses to some of these most fundamental questions. And second, the sophistry is the charge. So making the weaker the stronger cause, that's, I think, better put elsewhere in other more successful translations of this work, as making the weaker argument the stronger. And so that's really what sophists such as Gorgias did. So like lawyers in a courtroom, if their task is to defend one particular side or case, side of the case, one position, then again, like with rhetoric more broadly, they're not concerned with the truth, right? They're concerned with convincing either the jury or the judge of the strength of their position. Whether or not that strength coincides with the truth is a secondary consideration, right? So those are the things that Socrates has been charged with, and he vehemently denies both, right? He says, I'm not engaged in natural philosophy, but again, he says, not that I'm disparaging it, it's just not in my area of philosophical interest. And he's even more passionate about his repudiation of the sophistry charge, right? He says, I've never taught anybody anything. And that's because when you're engaged dialectically in some particular problematic or thematic, again, you're not trying to achieve by expanding your scope of understanding, embracing others in this kind of effort of conviction or persuasion. You're not trying to get them to become identical with you in that regard. You are engaged in this sort of dialogical enterprise towards the uncovering of the truth, whatever that might be, and it's going to ultimately be something that you did not previously know, and that remains, as we'll see, ultimately unpossessable. So then the question is, well, why, Socrates, if what you say is true, that these are false accusations, why is it that you have this reputation? And here's where we get the story of the oracle at Delphi. So he says, men of Athens, this reputation of mine has come of a certain sort of wisdom which I possess. If you ask me what kind of wisdom, I reply, such wisdom as is attainable by man. For to that extent, I am inclined to believe that I am wise. Whereas the persons of whom I was speaking have a superhuman wisdom, which I may fail to describe because I have it not myself. So the natural philosophers, those pre-Socratics, such as Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Anaxagoras, who is mentioned explicitly as a kind of materialist or an atheist materialist, they purport to have this kind of superhuman wisdom. Whereas Socrates says he has only human wisdom. Right? But what does that mean? So let's go back to the story. So Chaerephon goes to the oracle at Delphi, and you can visit vestiges of this oracle, or the temple now, or the oracle, a priestess who was a kind of supplicant and attendant for the god Apollo, whose divine presence was to some extent housed within that structure. And you could pose questions to which you would receive an oracular response. So the word oracular in English is a synonym for mysterious, right? And so the pronouncement on the part of the priestess at the oracle would require then interpretation. You would have to interpret it. And so that's what Socrates tries to do. So Chaerephon asks the oracle, is anyone wiser than Socrates? The oracle says, no. So Socrates says, but the truth is that God only is wise. And in this oracle, he means to say that the wisdom of men is worth little or nothing. He is not speaking of Socrates. He is only using my name as an illustration, as if he said, he is the wisest who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is in truth worth nothing. So what does Socrates say about his wisdom? Well, because of this, what he took to be a sort of divine charge or injunction on the part of Apollo delivered through the oracle, he seeks out whom he later dubbed the pretenders of wisdom in Athenian society. So first, this group marked as the politicians, right? So those who are supposed to have great wisdom in guiding the state. And he finds that they don't really know what they're talking about. And a good example of this could be given in the previous dialogue to the Apology, narratively speaking, the Euthyphro, where Socrates encounters Euthyphro, who is going, it turns out, to indict his own father for murder. And Socrates is caught aback by this. And because that would be, from the perspective of traditional Greek society, rather impious, right? It would be impious against your own parental authorities, right? So he asks, well, then you must have great knowledge of what piety is. So perhaps since I'm being indicted for impiety, for this kind of atheism, to put it that way, maybe you could instruct me, Socrates says. So please tell me what piety is. I want to know what it is. And he learns that Euthyphro, although he's quite haughty and arrogant initially, and in fact remains so even after the dialogue ends, it turns out that Euthyphro doesn't really know what piety is at all. He has caught in this sort of difficult loop of falling over himself, responding to one problem which poses a different problem, yet at the very end, he kind of glances at his watch and says, oh, well, I gotta go. And he leaves their discussion still thinking he's an expert on matters of piety. But what's the real practical conclusion or upshot of this? That Euthyphro is going to go into the courtroom and try to get his own father convicted of murder, even though if you know the details of the story, and I'm not going to get into that, it's not clear that he should be indicted for murder. It might have been a kind of accident. But because Euthyphro is so convinced that he knows what is pious, that is, what the gods and the authorities that might represent the gods prefer and ordain to be right, because he's so convinced of the truth of his own position, he is about to run headlong into something potentially quite immoral and disastrous, which would conclude in the death of his own father, right? So this is again to speak to the extent to which language, logos, discourse really matters, right? And so Socrates, after dealing with the politicians, he sees the poets, and he realizes that their knowledge of poetry isn't knowledge at all, because they can't speak in any detail about the sources of their inspiration or about the truths that get articulated through their inspired speech. Instead, they're just sort of out of their minds, right? They are in possession by the gods or the muses who use them as conduits for the communication or the deliverance of their truths to the realm of the mortals, right? And then next he goes on to the craftsmen, so the house builders, the shoemakers, the ship builders, the clothing makers, and so forth. The technicians, who he says ultimately have quite a bit of great knowledge. They know many things that he doesn't, but the good of that is offset by the fact that they improperly and artificially extend the scope of their expertise into areas over which they have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever, right? So it's like if you go to a mechanic that you really trust, but when you see the mechanic, you're forced to listen to some 20-minute diatribe about 5G or GMOs or something, and you think, man, could you please just fix my carburetor or whatever. So Socrates says, look, I don't really know anything in particular, anything very special, but at least I know that I don't know. And these figures, representing the politicians, representing the poets, who are great intellectual authorities, not just marginalized artists as they are now, and the craftsmen, they think they know all kinds of things, but in reality they don't. So on that score, at least, Socrates says he might be superior, he might be better. And that's what defines human wisdom. In other words, Socratic wisdom. But now we can look at the second set of accusations, which in reality amount to the full substance of the indictment, right? So what is the indictment that Meletus, on the part of himself, Anytus, and Lycon, are bringing to the court? That Socrates is a doer of evil and corrupter of the youth, and he does not believe in the gods of the state, and he has other divinities of his own. So in other words, what is Socrates accused of? Corrupting the youth and a kind of atheism, right? So I'm not going to get into the substance of the so-called aluncus. So let me move this for you. The aluncus, and that's the word to characterize the so-called Socratic method, with which perhaps you're already familiar, something you've heard of. But aluncus is best translated as something like cross-examination, and we see Socrates carry that out in his relating to Meletus. So in his confrontation with Meletus, where he ultimately shows that Meletus is being frivolous in bringing these charges to the court. But here's where Socrates says, I am a sort of gadfly given to the state by the god. And the state is like a great and noble steed who is tardy in his motions owing to his very size and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has given the state, and all day long and in all places I am always fastening upon you, arousing and persuading and reproaching you. So that's one point in the dialogue in which it's clear that dialectic is just like rhetoric is, but obviously in a different way, given its connection to truth, involved in persuasion or pistis, right? But in this case, it's persuasion, belief, conviction, in other words, pistis from the Greek, that's very much tied to the truth as such in its uncovering. But what are we to make of this image of the gadfly, right? Well, this shows us a fundamental tension between the demands of dialectic, of freely questioning the truths of reality, or the truths that are supposed to delimit reality, but having been achieved through various historical discourses. And then the demands of a political organization like the Athenian state here, which has its own purposes, has its own conditions, and ultimately has its own ways of shaping the citizenry, right? Which can be for the good or perhaps not for the good. But The image of the gadfly here, and we can use as a kind of metaphor what we know about, in a really kind of simplified sense, evolutionary theory. So think about how the gadfly, or in other words, the horsefly, is relating to the horse. So Socrates, or the philosopher, is the horsefly, and the state is the horse. Now, does the horsefly want to kill the horse as it seems to attack it, to bite it? Well, no. If the horse dies, eventually so will the sustenance of the fly, right? So the fly relies upon the horse. They're in a sort of symbiotic relationship. Now, of course, as Socrates himself mentions in the course of carrying out this metaphor, the horse would very much like to kill the fly that's biting it. And that's really what Athens achieves using this metaphor in the decision to convict and to execute Socrates. But think about something positive that the horsefly, and it's relating to the horse, or that the philosopher, and it's relating to the state, makes possible. So what are the canonical bodily features of the horse that we all recognize as an essential part of the horse, making it the sort of iconic beast? Well, its mane and its tail. These are things that the horse uses to whip and to push away the fly. But the horse could not have developed these independently of the antagonistic relationship that the fly is bringing to it, right? So if it weren't for the philosopher who is questioning and trying to stir or goad into action the sleeping and rather lazy horse, the horse, in this case, metaphorically standing in for the state, couldn't be what it is. Right? So that means that philosophy and politics, from this kind of Socratic or Platonic perspective, are engaged in a fundamental tension, a harmonious or fruitful tension, which might sound contradictory, but that just speaks to the radicality of Platonic political science. Plato and Socrates were much more radical thinkers with respect to the nature and domain of politics than would be someone like Aristotle, coming a little bit later on. So I don't want to say too much about that. But now let's go to this. So what about the examined life? So what is it that Socrates, as the gadfly, is goading the citizenry of this massive, lumbering, but sleepy horse into attending to? It says, for if I tell you that this would be a disobedience, and here he's referring to the possibility of him ceasing his philosophical practice, so no longer embroiling these reputable figures in Athenian society in these embarrassing discussions. He says he can't do this. That would amount to a disobedience to a divine command, which again is how he interpreted the pronouncement at the oracle. He thought that by seeking out someone who was wiser than he could sort of find a counterexample, right? He could find a means to contradict the pronouncement of the god, and that is what he interpreted the pronouncement ultimately to mean. That was his divinely sanctioned or ordered charge. But he says, so therefore that I cannot hold my tongue, you will believe that I am serious. And if I say again that the greatest good of man is daily to converse about virtue, and all that concerning which you hear me examining myself and others, and that the life which is unexamined is not worth living for human beings, that you are still less likely to believe. So the unexamined life is not worth living. In other words, the unexamined life would be in the sense of norms and the sense of the good, that is, in a normative register, inappropriate for the human. It would be against, it would be adverse our fundamental nature to slough off or abrogate what he's calling the examined life. But what is the examined life? It's to ask questions like I posed a moment ago in reference to the Euthyphro dialogue. What is piety, or the pious, or the holy, in other words? How do we circumscribe that domain in its specificity, in its discreteness, to separate it from that which it is not, right? And so how can we organize and lay out the landscape of this domain of the pious, for example, such that all pious acts, no matter how superficially different they might be, can be gathered together, so going back to that gathering function of logos, into the domain of the proper, into the proper domain of the pious, where the truth of the pious as such is brought to the light of day and thereby illuminated. So Euthyphro's error in that dialogue, one of his erroneous responses to the question, what is the pious, was, well, the pious is doing what I'm doing right now. It's going to court to indict even my own father for doing something bad, right? That's what's pious. And Socrates says, and this is similar to some moves that we saw with Socrates and Gorgias from that dialogue, he says, you're not answering the question, right? You're giving me an example of what is pious. But as an example, it problematically excludes all sorts of other examples which don't seem to resemble it, but would nevertheless count as pious. So making sacrifice to the gods, perhaps that's considered pious, but that doesn't look at all like going to court and indicting your father for murder. So without knowing what piousness or piety is in advance, you won't be able to recognize this or that example of piety when it comes up. Or the same with justice. What is a just act? What is an, you all right then? What is an unjust act? What is love? What is beauty? What is truth? And so forth. So that brings us to this kind of continuum of knowledge. So I was saying this at the big, sort of earlier in our discussion for today. But imagine at the bottom of this continuum, you have perfect ignorance. So like you bathed in the river leaf, you're in complete darkness and oblivion. And then at the very top, you would achieve perfect, unfettered, unlimited knowledge of the all, of the everything. Well, what Socrates is getting at here is we are never, as human beings, in either of these places. So even when we are first born into the world, when we are first thrust into the world as we know it, we aren't finding ourselves at this moment in a state of perfect ignorance or darkness, right? We're always already in some relationship. For instance, a fundamental relationship with our mother when we're born. And we come to occupy a space of roles and assignments that are already laid out and made possible and available in advance of our coming to be. So we come into a family where we already have a parent, two parents, a sibling, many siblings, an uncle, an aunt. We're in some indirect relation, even at the moment of our birth, to our parents' bosses and so forth, and their far-reaching associates. And this ever-expanding, circuitous, really complicated network of connections, right? So we're never in perfect ignorance, and we can never achieve perfect knowledge. So from the very moment of our birth up to the moment of our physical demise, we are like these points, somewhere along this continuum. The moment we uncover one previously obscure truth, thereby making it a truth, thereby revealing what was hidden, well, now we have buried over something else that will require our attention later on. And so this connects to another dialogue. And so this is one from Plato's middle period called the Symposium, which is all about the nature of love and beauty. Well, close to the start of that dialogue, Socrates says something strange. He claims there to be an expert in erotics, right? That sounds kind of gross if we're talking about this old, kind of ugly, white dude. He's an expert in erotics. What does that mean? Well, erotics would be the study of love. That is the study of eros. And it's a strange thing for him to say, because seeing the Apology, where he is quite explicit that all that he knows is that he knows nothing? What would it mean to say that he's an expert in love? Well, what is the nature of love? It's actually parallel to the nature of knowledge. There is a fundamental affinity there. So imagine you find love, um, you marry your significant other, and you're together for 40 years or something. Next thing you know, you're sitting at a golden corral across from each other, just staring at your ever coldening mac and cheese, just hoping that the other doesn't talk because, of course, you've heard everything he has to say and you just can't bear it anymore. And everything is just so boring. There's nothing mysterious. There is nothing more to discover. There's nothing more to experience in your relationship. It's just this unrelenting um, kind of suffocation, right? Now, obviously, that's not a very positive characteristic or characterization of a loving relationship, right? It's not ideal. And that's because the true beloved, the true object, to put it that way, of our love remains a source of mystery. There's always something more to learn or experience with them. And in fact, thinking that you have finally achieved them as a kind of possession, right? So love is related to desire, right? We desire our beloved, but we never conclude the active unfolding of that emotional relationality of desire and its complicated economy to a kind of possession, right? That would be something we could describe as pornographic, right? Where your beloved is possessed now and forever. Everything about him or her is revealed, is exposed to the light of day, and there's nothing hidden from you, right? That would not be love. And similarly, it would not be knowledge to think that you could ever walk away from the process of coming to learn with an object possessed. So think about it this way. So recall Socrates' spirited rejection of the charge that he is engaged in what I call natural philosophy, which from the text was defined as studying things in the sky and below the earth. Remember, that which is withheld from the possibility of human experience. And this is what he means by more than human or superhuman wisdom, which he contrasts with his own human wisdom. But why? Well, let's use this image. So imagine this sphere represents the cosmos, and that means literally from the Greek, the all or the everything. So it's synonymous with our sense of universe now. So this sphere contains everything that you could ever possibly know, and let's say each one of these little dots is a fact, which could be uncovered in its truth or could be known. Well, let me move this. Okay. To have perfect or superhuman knowledge, you would have to be outside of this sphere, above it, below it, etc. You would have to be here, 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 from every possible angle. Let's call that the God's eye view of the whole. And this is what the ancients referred to as cosmotheoros. So cosmo, of course, referring to cosmos, the all or the totality of being, and theoros, which is related to our English word theory or theoretical. And for the Greeks, theorein, which is to engage in this act of theorizing or theoretical thinking, is to relate to the object of your theorizing, the content of your thinking, as a spectator does. So it's a kind of spectatorial knowledge. And so great examples of theoretical knowledge for the Greeks would be, for example, the astronomical bodies, like the planet Jupiter, for instance. Now, if I want to know astronomical truths about Jupiter, whatever I come to learn is not in any immediate or direct way going to affect my life, right? So I can think of the object Jupiter as a spectator does. So think about if you go to a baseball game where you might be on the sidelines cheering things on, and perhaps that helps, I don't know. But now, of course, nobody is in the audience at these athletic events, right? So you're just watching on the television. And, how the game concludes isn't necessarily going to affect your life in any meaningful way. Of course, you could have, bets made or whatever. You could have money riding on the outcome, or you could just be really passionately invested in your team. But, give it a few days or so, and the sting of loss will dissipate, whether you want it to or not, right? Because it's ultimately not that important for you, because you're looking at the game as a spectator does, which means you could be a kind of sports analyst, stand outside of the game, and pin down all these various important, cool analytical facts that can be shared and preserved and serve various functions. You couldn't do that if you were in the game playing third base, right? You're too invested, you're too entangled in it. Well, Socrates' point here is that you are one of these points, right? And because you're one of these points, and let's say you want to know about what's going on over here, this fact or this potential truth, so you relate to it, and that now becomes a kind of line of flight where you are oriented towards this phenomenon, this appearance, this happening, and you want to disclose it in its illumination, in its reality. But you're only doing so from a finite, that is limited perspective, right? Now, this reminds me of a story that my colleague from Native American Studies, Dr. Brooke Colley, likes to talk about often, the truth of the pumpkin, where there's this, so imagine there's an elder, a Native American elder, who has a pumpkin at the center of a talking circle. And the members of the tribe have to sit around the pumpkin and discuss it. And someone asks, well, what is the truth of the pumpkin? Well, the truth of the pumpkin is the pumpkin itself, the source of the discourse or the perspective of everyone who would be around it. But every perspective is needed, is necessary for the fulfillment of the truth of the pumpkin and its presencing as a whole. Because I can only see one profile or one side of it, and on the other side, you can only see another profile or side of it. But, and this is my philosophical contribution to the truth of that story, what makes the various different perspectives so urgent is the fact that when you see the pumpkin, even though it's from a very limited, finite perspective, you don't understand your limited, finite perspective to be that. So when I look at the pumpkin, I obviously only have access to one side of it at a given time, but it's not as if I see or think that is supposed that on the other side of it, there's just some gaping void, right? I think in some sense, I have access to the whole, even if it isn't whole. So this means I could erroneously be going on thinking I know more about the object of my investigation, in this case, the pumpkin, than I truly do. And that's dangerous, right? Speaking of dangerous, so I want to give some examples. So what are examples of those who use rhetoric? Well, people like lawyers, as we see in the Apology, politicians, and advertisers, right? So this is an example in advertising. This is KFC's Chizza, which was characterized, this wasn't my saying, I found this online, a journey into regret. So in this ad, if there were some words, for example, describing what horror, what monstrosity is before you, the aims of the advertiser are to get you to desire it, right? They want you to go buy it. They want you to love it and eat it. They want you to want it and then want it more. And they want you to tell others about it. So obviously, they're going to reveal certain things about it. They're going to reveal this object in a particular light so that it's as attractive as possible, but they're also going to withhold. They're going to conceal other things. So it's not as if you're going to read, even in fine print, in an ad like this, yeah, if you eat this enough, you're going to get gout, or you're eventually going to die of heart disease, or something like that. Right? That wouldn't help with their marketing efforts. Right? That wouldn't get you to buy it. Right? And how does that work? And these are some conclusions. So we're wrapping up here. Well, rhetoricians like lawyers, politicians, and advertisers share the same fundamental aim, which is to convince others, typically an at least somewhat heterogeneous multitude, of something, whether or not it is true, such as that the chizza is edible, right? How do they do it? Well, they do so by navigating, again, this dynamic economy of revealing some things and concealing others, which is determined by the relevant withdrawn background of prejudices, biases, fears, desires, aspirations, anxieties, etc. So think about politicians like Trump or Biden who are on the campaign trail. Now, depending upon where geographically they are in the country, there are going to be different backgrounds with which they're dealing in their rhetorical performance. So some parts of the country are going to be more concerned with jobs in the economy, jobs like jobs from the coal industry or from steel mills or something in the Midwest. Or perhaps on the West Coast, they'd be more concerned with climate change and the increasing fire seasons and so forth, right? So depending upon where the politicians go on the stump, they have to attune themselves to their audience. They have to adjust whatever it is that they're delivering in their rhetorical exhibition in order to achieve the ultimate goal of all rhetoric, which is conviction or persuasion, right? So they have to say certain things, have to reveal some things. If they conceal too much, they'll either appear ignorant of what they're talking about, or perhaps worse, deceptive. So they have to reveal some things, but they have to be careful about not revealing too much. Otherwise, they'll alienate some they'll alienate some part of the population that they're attempting to convince. So whereas the aim of dialectic is to bring these implicit elements from out of the background into the light of day, making them explicit, rhetoric effectively functions only when they are kept hidden. Right? So rhetoricians pinpoint and exploit these withdrawn points of anxiety and fear, aspirations, desire, and so forth in order to manipulate them. So a political example of this, I mean, just think about why data, your data, is now considered the most profitable commodity, right? So this is a part of what critics are referring to as surveillance capitalism. So a couple of years ago, there was the big Cambridge Analytica scandal in association with the 2016 Trump campaign, where it was found that roughly 50 million Facebook users or accounts were mined for data, and profiles were built of around 240 million Americans, and those behind Cambridge Analytica boasted that they had 4,000 to 5,000 data points on each American. Why would that be so important? Why would that be so valuable? Except that we understand that we are not these perfectly free and autonomous dialectical machines that can in some final way illuminate and come to terms with all of our hidden assumptions and presuppositions and so forth, right? And so dialectic wants to bring these implicit elements from out of the background into the light of day, making them explicit. We want to make explicit our implicit presuppositions, prejudices, and biases. And this can make us more free from the control of rhetorical strategies. But as demonstrated in Socrates' defense, it's impossible to illuminate and diffuse every dangerous assumption at once, given that there is always a more or less obscure background at play. As humans, we cannot be the cosmotheoros. And this is why Socrates says, excuse me, that if he's convicted, it won't be because of Meletus, Anytus, or Lycon who brought the indictment, and this is what you might think, but because of the rhetorical conviction that had already won before Socrates had even entered the courtroom. And so this might explain his behavior in the court as a kind of asshole, right? He is deliberately provoking them because he knew Dialectic could not win the day, but by performing dialectically and by making himself a kind of martyr, he could advance the legitimately good ends of philosophy. So what is human wisdom? To wrap up here, knowing that you don't know. No, it's a kind of higher order knowledge. It's not knowledge of any content, but it's knowledge of your capacity in any given particular moment for knowledge itself. So knowing, in other words, that the path to wisdom for mortal human beings does not terminate at any final possession of truth, knowledge, etc. And this means that truth is not a possession to be won or lost at all, but instead a couple things. Truth is one, an urgency that inspires us towards it, and two, a norm that lets us know when our efforts to express the truth are either adequate or inadequate, letting us know when we have more work to do. And so lastly, I'll leave you with the so-called Dunning-Kruger effect. So I encourage you to look this up. So this is some contemporary work in psychology, which is very much resonant with these kind of Socratic Platonic insights about the nature of truth and knowledge and the human relationship to it in our various capacities. So the Dunning-Kruger effect essentially says that those who are most stupid, the dumbest of us, are least capable of recognizing how dumb or stupid that they are, right? Thereby preventing themselves from ever leaving that state, ever leaving that condition of leith, right, towards aletheia or truth. So the Dunning-Kruger effect says that there's this cognitive bias. And so we've been talking about biases here. And this is the deepest one. This is the kind of emblematic, comprehensive bias that contains all of them, in which people of low ability have illusory superiority and mistakenly assess their cognitive ability as greater than it is. Those with deficits of knowledge and expertise lack the ability to recognize those deficits and thus tend to think that they are performing competently despite potentially making error after error. And so I'll leave you with the question to consider. Given all of this, how should we better articulate the nature of scientific or philosophical or other kinds of expertise? If infallible, absolute, perfect knowledge at the top of that continuum is never available for human beings, if people, no matter how smart, how educated, can be wrong, what does it mean to really be an expert? So think about that. And I talked way longer than I hoped to today, and most of the other lectures will not be this long. But hopefully, even if you don't get through it all in one sitting, this will be helpful for you. But I appreciate you for staying with me. And yeah, I'll see you later.